was sharing a little bit of my Ohio roots with Angie and Kirsten before we started, but my father grew up in a town not too far from Toledo called Piqua, Ohio. My granddad was a county judge down there, and my family had farms and a variety of other assets. And the unique part of the story is that my father passed all of the ownership in our family business in Piqua to me and didn't split it between me and my brothers. I'm the middle of three brothers. So at the age of 22, I had to figure out my father passed away at that point and handed all the ownership to me. And so at 22, I had to figure out how to work with my dad's cousins and how to work collaboratively with my brothers to make decisions about the family farm, because my father also told me that I needed to share the income from that ownership equally, even though I got all the responsibility. So I had a unique kind of family business mess that I got thrown into at a very young age. And it's a big part of what kind of motivated me to work with family businesses. So I'm just gonna, can you enable me to share screen? I will start sharing some slides here. Here we go. All right. And if I can do this, here we go. All right, so today we're gonna talk about board governance in particular. So we're gonna talk about business governance, but we're gonna talk about how it exists in the context of the overall family governance system. We're gonna talk about the role and impact of family unity on family business performance. We're going to talk about some research that looks at families that had survived for 200 years together and what are some of the unique things that make them special. And we're going to focus in at the end specifically kind of on the role of the board, because one of the things we're going to do in the spring is help families think about, if I were to put together a board, what would it look like? What would it be doing? We often kind of, when we hear about boards, we think about boards with a public company model, that it's about power and control and it's about politics and jockeying. And in a family business, a board can be a very different entity. As Angie said, she sent out a worksheet before the session, and it's not super complicated because I'll also read the questions here, but we'd like to take a second here at the beginning to ask you to reflect on these three questions. What are the challenges facing our family business in the next 5 to 10 years? What are some of the dilemmas that we're facing around succession? And then the one we're going to talk about in a second is, what are the questions and or concerns that you have about having a board of directors or putting together a board of directors? Some of you may already have a board, I'm not sure, but what are the questions you have about boards in particular that you might want us to address either today or in the programs that we put together in the spring? So I'm going to give you guys a second or two to think about that. And then I'm going to just ask people to jump in with any thoughts. And also, if you want to put some of your ideas in the chat, that's great, because then other people, if we don't get to everybody, we can actually capture those and share those with others. So the three questions again are, what are the challenges that your family business is facing in the next 5 to 10 years? What are the dilemmas that we're facing around succession? And then what are our questions around boards? So I'll give a second for people to think about that. So the reason I ask you guys to think about the challenges that your family business is facing in 5 to 10 years and the dilemmas of succession is that your governance systems should be an important part of helping you solve those questions, answer those questions, work through those questions. And so if we're clearer about what those challenges are, it enables us to think more carefully about how we want to address those challenges and how we want to engage others in supporting us in pursuing those questions. So Angie put in the chat, hearing a lot on, do I want to pass it on to the family, or do I sell now while the market's hot? So that's a great question. And it's actually kind of the core question that every family business has to face, which is, why do I want to be in business, right? So when you start a business, you choose your business partners. In a family business, you inherit your business partners. So every generation has to decide, why do we want to do this? And we're going to talk about this in a second, that if it's just about money, then it probably leading towards selling is a better solution. But if there are other things that are important to you beyond just the financial returns, your people, your community, your next generation, obviously that influences your approach to this. But since today is about governance, I'd love to hear a few thoughts from people on what are the questions that I have around boards and governance that you'd like to have us try to address today. And I would just encourage anybody who wants to speak up to unmute and chime in.
Do you find it's more beneficial to have a subject matter specialist? So if I'm a manufacturer, I want people with manufacturing expertise, or more generalists to help me see a bigger picture outside of the specifics of manufacturing?
That's a great question. So I'll talk about that a little bit later, but it's a great question, and I'll make sure that we address it. What other questions do people have?
I think the issue of compensation is always applicable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a conversation I hear often is, how much money do I pay people, and how do I make sure I'm getting a return on that investment? How do I know I'm getting a return on that investment? So talk about that. What other questions do people have?
Board size and meeting frequency.
Mm-hmm.
Are you looking, can you define the governance end of it, or are they an advising board? It's kind of like more of a question too.
Sorry, can you say that again?
In terms of the governance, you mentioned governance, board of governance. Mm-hmm. Is it more of a governance definition, or is it more of a board of advisors that we also look for family businesses?
Yep. So we'll look at that exact question is how does a board of advisors or a board of directors fit into the family governance system, because there are different types of governance that we're talking about. Maybe one or two more before we move on.
I think the makeup of the board, who sits on it, either skill set, experience, family members, staff members, outsiders, and then also how do you find the right people for those seats?
Mm-hmm. Great.
I see in the chat how to run a meeting, how to prepare for a meeting. A question I get a lot is, how much control do I give my board?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. All great questions, and all things that we're gonna work to answer. We'll be able to hit on a bunch of these today, and some of these other ones about how to run a meeting, that is going to be a big part of the program that we put together in the spring for everybody. So these are all perfect questions, right on the mark. So thank you for that. I'm going to move forward a little bit and get a little bit deeper into what we're talking about today in terms of governance. Let's see here. So the question that a lot of people struggle with is kind of, why have a board? I've been successful to this point, and the challenge is that our business grows and our family grows, that we have to kind of balance these three systems: our family system, our ownership system, and our business system, right? And each of these systems has a different mentality. The family system, is based on loyalty. It's based on, you can't choose who your family members are. You can choose whether you talk to them, but you're still in a relationship with them, even if you're not talking to them. It's families tend to think in equality terms. A friend of mine likes to say, as families were socialist, as businesses were capitalist, and there's a little bit of a tension in that, right? So as family members, we're supposed to be equal, but we may be unequal in other ways, right? And so you overlap that with an ownership system that's trying to produce financial returns for the shareholders, and a business system that's trying to grow and develop and needs resources for in reinvestment and growth. There are a lot of competing priorities that show up that have to be managed. And a board is one piece of what can help manage and balance these three circles. I love this quote. This came out of research. The research that I'm going to share today is the research that I referenced that looked at families that had survived for 200 plus years together. And it was a deep study that looked at what was it that enabled them to survive for 200 years. And it was a quote from one of the people. It says, "Conflict immediately comes up when clear rules, structures, and value systems are missing." And we think that we have all that. Sorry, my screen here is blocking the, there we go. We think we have all of these. That means that as a family, we grow up with a clear set of rules. There are clear-cut issues that we absorb with mother's milk. But so what they were saying is that we've worked hard to build clear value systems, structures, and rules and processes so that the family knows what their role is in the system and how we can interact effectively together. And governance is a big part of that equation. So what this research showed is that ownership, unity, and family cohesion are the greatest strategic advantages of a family business. That at the end of the day, if we don't have a unified ownership group about where we're going and what we're trying to do, that we're not going to be successful. I often say that most families don't fail because they can't solve the business problems. Most family businesses fail because they can't work through the family issues. So the question becomes, what are we doing to build a sense of ownership, unity, and family cohesion that can sustain us for the future? So that doesn't mean that we're all trapped together forever, right? I always like to say it's how do we build a coalition of the willing that's committed to a common future together. So I referenced before, when you start a business, you get to choose your business partners. Every generation has to recommit and say, why are we in business together? What do we want to accomplish together? And how does that align with where we are today and where our business is going? Because when you look at a lot of the families that have survived for 200 years, often they're not in the business that they started in. Because when you go back a couple hundred years, you're talking agrarian economy, and the world has changed immeasurably across those years. So your business oftentimes has to morph and grow, sometimes following the interests of the next generation, sometimes following innovation, et cetera. And if our family's not and our owners aren't unified and cohesive, it's really hard to make some of those changes. So all of this is just to say our family relationships are critical to success across generations. And I'll also say that you're having emotional challenges in the family, oftentimes structure will not solve emotional differences within the family. You need to work on those emotional differences. The structures we put in place, the boards can help moderate the effects of those, but at the end of the day, you still have to work through your emotional challenges as a family. But the problem we get into in a family business is that we sometimes see things as a dichotomy. Are we a business first family or a family first business? Do we always sacrifice for the business, or we always sacrifice for the family? And seeing the family in this kind of simplistic way is a bit of a disservice because most family business issues aren't clear cut, that it's just a business issue and you work through it, or just a family issue. I'll give you a real life example of a non-family director who was chairing the board of a family that I know. So there was a family member that was having performance issues and actually had a problem with alcohol and was showing up at industry association events having had too much alcohol. And this board chairman saw this, oh, this is a clear business issue that we just need to treat like a business issue and fire this family member, with no consideration for the impact that that would have on the family. Now, I'm not saying that that person doesn't need to be accountable for their actions. So what we ended up doing is working a process that both addressed the business accountability as well as, we care for you as a family member. We're concerned that you may be having problems with alcohol. We want to help you with that. And so we devised a solution that helped balance both the business needs for accountability and the family needs of getting that help for that person to make sure that they're healthy. So most issues in a family business can't be seen in a dichotomy that it's just a business issue or it's just a family issue. They tend to be a bit more complex. So we're left with, how do we balance the needs of the family with the needs of the business? I always say that, you know, the best families aren't family first or business first. The best families know when they need to sacrifice for the health of the family, and they know when they need to sacrifice for the health of the business. And they work hard to cultivate a sense of in the family about what we need to do to assure the business's success, what we need to invest into operations, how we need to finance our businesses, what our strategy is. And then we balance our relationship with the business through family employment policies, thinking about dividends, et cetera. But the real challenge is, how do we constantly balance family and business? And our governance mechanisms are one of the things that help us inject objectivity, thoughtfulness, and process into how we balance these needs. So coming back to this is, how do we maintain balance between these systems? Because we know that when the family is dominating the conversation, we're often not paying enough attention to the business. So this is the family where you've got a lot of family conflict and drama going on. And so we're not paying enough attention to the future of the business. We're getting caught up in family conflicts and family fights, and that's causing us to lose sight of the business and the business issues. Then if the ownership system dominates, you know, we're more likely to be a harvester or a proprietor. We're taking money out of the business. And that's not a bad thing always, right? But every business needs reinvestment to grow and thrive and survive. So are we balancing that effectively? Are we looking at the strategic needs of the business for reinvestment and growth, and balancing that with the ownership's need for liquidity as well? And then if we focus just on the business, if, you know, I have a family that I worked with about 15 years ago, and $2 billion company, they were paying out 0.05% in dividends. So they had a large number of family members that were extremely wealthy on paper, but one of the family members had to get a second job so that they could afford Christmas gifts. So this family was so focused on the business and the business's growth and development that they weren't attending to family needs, and it started to create a lot of problems within the family. So they had to kind of figure out how to rebalance. And our governance mechanisms are how we do this. How we inject objective thought into this, how we think carefully through some of these issues. Because the other thing that we face over time in a family business is the growth of the family. We say that families grow exponentially, businesses grow arithmetically. So most often our businesses can't grow at the rate our family can. So this chart comes from, it's a simplification from a project we did with a family. So it was, having worked at a Catholic university, we saw a lot of families that grew very quickly. So this family had 12 kids in the second generation. And when we were having this conversation, they had 36 kids in the third generation, and a number of those kids were married and starting to have kids. So we did a project and we used some basic assumptions to look at how many family members are in the family today and how many family members will we have in 10, 15, 20 years if we use some basic assumptions about birth rates and death rates. And, basically what we found was that within a short amount of time, we were going to go from about 45 family members to about 150 family members. And so the question was not, is that good or is that bad? It's like, how are we going to manage that? How does that influence how we think about ownership, passing ownership? How does that influence how we talk to the next generation and think about putting governance in place? So that complexity changes. And when you get to third and fourth generations and you have large family shareholder groups, you're often dealing more with age cohorts than you are people in generations, because some of these large families will end up with the youngest in one generation having more in common with the oldest in the generation behind them than they do with the people in their own generation. So all of this is to say, there's a lot of complexity to building a sense of unity and cohesion in our family and our business. And we have to put some energy behind that. So when we talk about cohesion, I think it's important to get concrete about it. It sounds like a nice kind of airy thing. But what do we really mean when we talk about cohesion? We mean a feeling of unity that results in a common sense of purpose and leads us to joint action. So we cultivate a common sense of purpose, a common sense of connection with each other, and then move to act together. So from a family perspective, the question from a governance perspective is how do we cultivate that common sense of purpose as a family about where we're going, what we're trying to accomplish? And, one of the tensions that I often see is around the next generation coming in with new ideas. And one of the common disconnects that happens is that for the parents' generation, it feels like every suggestion to do something differently is a criticism of the way things are and the way things have been built, rather than an honest attempt to improve the system. So that's part of the emotional part that comes out from a family perspective. So thinking about, is our leadership and our governance building this sense of unity, this common sense of purpose, and moving to joint action? So with real cohesion, we have a high desire of people to remain in the group, a low desire to leave, and it's not coerced, right? So in many situations in a family business, people can be stuck. Either you can't sell your shares, or your only option to sell your shares is at an extremely low price. So why would anybody sell their shares at that level? Or it could be, well, if you don't stay in the family business, then you're not going to be invited to Thanksgiving dinner. I'm being a little dramatic there, but you'd be surprised at what some families will do to try to keep people in the family business when they don't want to be there. So we want a cohesive group that are committed to that common purpose, right? We want everybody to have an answer to that question of why do we want to be in business together? So this research on 200-year-old families found that there were four main dimensions of the cohesion and connection between the family members. So I'm going to start on the bottom of this chart. There's family financial and business financial. So when the business is successful, this is the business financial, it creates cohesion, right? When the business is thriving, that creates a sense of connection and cohesion. Family financial means when we use the resources of the family, the financial resources of the family to help each other, that increases cohesion. So this is we're going to help you with a down payment on a house. If somebody gets into some issues with healthcare costs or other financial needs, we use the financial resources of the family to help each other. But the interesting thing about this research is that the business financial and family financial variables were necessary but not sufficient. So over time, you needed enough financial success to survive, but it wasn't all that you needed. If you wanted to survive for 200 years or more, you needed to have family emotional cohesion and business emotional cohesion. And we're gonna split into groups shortly to talk about this. But before we do, I want to tell you what family emotional cohesion and business emotional cohesion are. So, family emotional cohesion is our basic sense of connection to each other as family members, and cultivating our relationships with each other. How much time do we spend talking to each other, connecting with each other, etc. Because the level of trust and connection as family members directly correlates with the capability to solve problems and work through conflicts. If I don't know, this is something I found out when I inherited my shares of my family business, was my father had tried to insulate us from his cousins because he found his cousins to be a little bit crazy. And that really doesn't speak anything about my dad's cousins. It really speaks to his emotional relationship with them, that he really struggled with them. So he tried to insulate us from them. So when I inherited ownership, I had no relationship with those shareholders, which made it really hard for me to figure out how to, what motivates somebody, what are they interested in, what do they care about, and where are areas of commonality, where are areas of differences. And so I spent a lot of the first few years of my ownership in the family business just learning who my dad's cousins were. And so I'm a 22-year-old talking to people in their late 50s or 60s and early 70s that live all over the country, only one of which had been back to Piqua in the 10 years before. So that family emotional attachment, that family communication is critical to longevity in family businesses. And then business emotional is having a sense of pride in what we're doing together as a family, having a sense of being a part of something greater than ourselves, and that our business isn't just about financial returns. It's about our people, our people's growth and development. It's about what we mean to our community, what we give back to our community. It's about what our business means for society. You know, one of our families that we work with says, you know, the greatest philanthropy we have is that we employ 7,000 people, right? We help those people, and that is one of our core aspects of our identity. So when we have a sense of pride in what we're doing, and this business is about more than just the financial returns, and we have a strong sense of connection to each other as family members, that cohesiveness that comes out of it gives us a strong foundation to solve the natural problems that come up in a growing family and a growing business system. And if there's one thing I've learned from families being a part of an organization like the University of Toledo Family Business Center, is that when we get in the room together, it's often a sigh of relief because we don't feel so isolated, we don't feel so alone, and we realize that our issues are really, other people share those issues and those struggles. And so what I'm going to ask you guys to think about and talk about in your breakout groups is, what are we doing? Share your best practices, your best bets, the things that you've done well within a family to build your sense of family emotional cohesion. What do we do to build our relationships together on a regular basis? And or you can also identify, what are the things we're doing to build a sense of pride in our business and what we're doing in the community. And I want to have you guys share some of those experiences. And I'll give one quick example to help you. So on the family emotional attachment side, I'll give you an example of how my brothers and I have done this. So many of you may have Christmas cards, and I'm going to stop sharing here for a second. Many of you may have Christmas cards, you know, you send out with pictures of the kids. my family has done that from the beginning. The first one was my older brother on a green corduroy couch in our house in a Santa suit as an infant. Over the course of the years, there were probably 6 or 7 pictures of some configuration of the 3 of us on that green corduroy couch. When my older brother moved out after college, he got the green corduroy couch in his apartment. When I moved out after college, I got the green corduroy couch in my apartment. When my younger brother moved out after college, he said, I don't want to have anything to do with that green corduroy couch. That's been in too many places. So we took that corduroy couch into the alley behind my house, tore off all the fabric. And then my younger brother, he was living in Manhattan at the time, and he went around to tailors in Manhattan saying, will you create a green jacket out of this green corduroy scraps of couch? And it took him about 10 or 15 tailors till he found a tailor who would do it. But we created a green jacket out of the green corduroy couch, and we have an annual golf tournament within the family for the green jacket. And it's really funny because the jacket, you couldn't get a full panel for the back, so it's like 4 pieces, and then you couldn't get a full piece for the sleeve, so there's a big seam in the middle of it. So, but it's this great piece of family history and a great bonding moment, especially as the next generation is coming in, they're entering their teens and starting to enter the golf tournament. It's a really kind of family cohesive. That's just a little example. So our hope in this breakout session is that you'll share some of the things that your families have done well to build that family cohesion or that sense of pride in the business with each other. So with that, if I could ask Kirsten to split people into groups, and we'll give you 5 to 10 minutes to talk through some of those best practices that you guys have experienced.
Very direct from Communicate. One of the things that we talked about that made it easy from a family or a business emotional point of view for the dimensions of cohesion is that the Communicate family, which is first generation, and the siblings are all involved in running the business right now, as well as they're all interested in the creative side. And that's what they're proficient in. So I think that just leads naturally to family emotion as well as the business emotional side of running a business.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, and I think it's really important to recognize that you need both sides of that equation. You need to have the business side and the family side.
Correct.
What other examples came out that were really interesting?
The individual I was in the room with kind of just hit on what you just said. They have a board and have had a board for 6 years with outside of the family members. And they also have family meetings that can talk about that specific business, but also maybe some ancillary businesses and other issues. And he found that has been very beneficial to build that cohesiveness, having both of those different sets. He actually ran the family meetings with agendas and notes and ran it like a real meeting.
Yeah, I mean, it can feel a little awkward at first because, you know, as a family, we're just supposed to kind of get along, right? We're just supposed we don't have the idea of having agendas and structures to conversations as a family may feel a little foreign to us because, you know, we're just supposed to get together and have dinner. And the other thing is, you know, we have a lot of measures of success for what it means to be a successful business, you know, profits, you know, efficiency, all of these things. But what does it mean to be a successful family? And have we ever had that conversation about what does it mean to be a successful family? What do we want to accomplish together as a family? What do we want to do together as a family? And that conversation in itself can build a sense of cohesion. Maybe one more example, and then we'll move forward. Okay, I'm going to call on Chris Anderson because I know Chris. I've talked to him over the years, and I'm going to put him on the spot. So I feel more comfortable putting somebody I know on the spot. So Chris, do you want to jump in with any thoughts?
Well, hi, conversation. Thanks. When we were talking, I said my own experiences when I look at your chart, my experiences, it felt like a pinball machine. The early on, the challenges of sorting that out. And I don't believe that family size is necessarily the challenge. It's you've already identified that. But what people ask me is, when did you get a board? And I've done some research internally like you did, Andrew. So I looked at the growth of the family over time, as well as the sales and income and people count. And it took us from 1947 to 1985 to have our first board, and that was our first loss year. At the same time, so our core business is under pressure. And the second thing is the family had reached its peak, where it was right where they were starting to get older and they were starting to wonder what ownership meant. So that would be the first thing, is that getting to the starting line is very challenging. And for us, it was a ritual where it had to be a defining moment before we got there. And so I'll just leave it at that. I'll just say, for us, it was messier than you might think. There were some courageous moves that were required, and it was the pain of the reality, the current pain of the reality, and that whole thing about the pain of the current reality and the pain of the uncertainty. The uncertainty became less of a painful concept than the internal pain we knew.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, and you raise a good question, which is, there are times when we do some of these things because we finally have reached a pain point, and can we shift to a mode where we're really looking forward and thinking about what do we need moving forward, and not waiting for the pain point to do it, because sometimes it can be harder to put some of these things in place in the midst of pain than it is when things are going well. So thank you for that, Chris, and thank you for letting me put you on the spot there for a second.
You're welcome.
All right, I'm going to jump back into the presentation here, and we'll keep moving on and see if I can. There we go. All right. So we've talked about the cohesion. So our governance has to be kind of looking at that. And to build sustainable cohesion, our structures are sorry, this is somehow moving. Our board of directors, our shareholder agreements, we need some of those structures to make sure that we're working on these things regularly. So somebody was referencing family meetings, a family council. That creates consistency and structure, and make sure that we have these conversations. Now, we also need the informal structures of reaching out to each other, building trust, building a stewardship mentality, shared values. We need to manage ambiguity, right? Things don't change quickly. We need to train the next generation. These are all things we need to do to build cohesion. So how does our governance fit into this equation? So I thought I'd start by just kind of trying to help everybody get clear about what do we mean when we talk about governance. So we're talking about how do we organize to make decisions and create accountability. How do we decide who's got a voice in making what decisions? How are decisions made? Who is accountable for making decisions? All of these things, when there's ambiguity or confusion in these areas, that creates the opportunity for tension and misalignment. So when we have clarity in voice and decision making, it makes it easier for us to operate, right? We're not asking who's in charge of something. We know who's in charge and we're working through it. So governance helps us provide clarity on how decisions are made. It helps us distinguish what's a family issue, a business issue, and an ownership issue. I know one of the challenges that many families face is when family issues are showing up in the business, in management meetings or business meetings, and how do we make sure that there's enough of a boundary between the family, the business, and the ownership issues, and have family members have healthy expectations. So I have one family that owns 14 restaurants. One of their family members walked into one of the restaurants, didn't like the silverware that was on the table, and started talking to the maitre d' about, you have to change the silverware. This silverware doesn't work. And that was a gross overstepping of boundaries, because this person didn't work for the company. They're a minority owner. And, it's not that they shouldn't have the concern or voice their concern, but they need to do it through the right channels and not to the maitre d'. Talk about it in the family council, and if appropriate, share that feedback for the people in the business. But the governance needs to be focused on building that family cohesion. So on the family side, family meetings or a family council are the governance mechanisms that are typically used. So family meetings means getting together regularly to talk about the family issues and the family's connection and ownership issues in relation to the business. A family council is usually formed when the family gets large enough that you can't get everybody in the same room. And we're going to talk in depth in a second about the business governance, board of advisors and board of directors, and we're going to try to get to some of the questions you guys asked, is really governing the business side of this, the day-to-day operations, and holding the management team accountable for articulating a vision and achieving a vision. And then many families are developing ownership meetings separate and apart from family meetings, because they may have family members who don't have shares. Maybe they're married in family members, and they want to have some discussions just amongst the owners. So these are some of the common governance mechanisms that families put in place. But any of these governance systems, no matter whether they're family, business, or ownership, there are these 5 principles of good governance, which they provide legitimacy and voice. So we have a place or a forum where we can go and talk about issues. They provide a sense of direction, thinking about where we're going. They monitor performance. So your family meetings and your family council monitor the performance on the family side. What's going on? What are we struggling with? What do we need help with? Governance provides accountability and tries to assure fairness, right? And of course, in a family business, fair isn't always equal, and equal isn't always fair. So fairness is a really important process here. And the research shows that even if a decision goes against my opinion, if I feel that the process was fair, that my voice was heard, that I will support that decision, and I won't be as I won't create a lot of conflict if I feel that process was fair. If I feel like people listened to me, they valued my opinion, you are creating voice and cohesion. When we are not listening to people, when we are shutting people down and people are feeling unheard, that tends to create negative emotions that come out sideways. So in general, if we can have fair process, openness, and transparency in our governance, that's going to help us. So the typical things that family governance focuses on is, why do we want to be in business together? What are our values? What's our mission and vision? How do we stay connected through communication and education? How do we develop the human capital of the family? One of the families I work with says their family council's job is to help every family member find their sweet spot, which is that convergence between what am I good at, what am I passionate about, and what does the world need? And sometimes that involves the family business, and sometimes it doesn't. Your ownership governance thinks about what businesses do we want to be in? What's our return on capital? What risk level do we want to take in? How are we evaluating and electing our board? The business governance, which is the board, its primary role is to hold management accountable, represent the interest of the shareholders, and increasingly all of the stakeholders, and review and approve succession plans and all of those important planning pieces. So all of this is to say that we need governance to help balance these 3 circles. And the research actually supports this. And if you think about these 3 things, boards of directors, strategic planning, and family meetings, they're all processes and governance processes whereby we get people aligned about the future and stay connected with each other. So this is a friend of mine wanted to prove that succession planning led to successful transition. in family business. And he did the research and he found no correlation between succession planning and successful transition. And he said, I must have screwed up, so I need to do this again. And he did it again. And there was no correlation between succession planning and successful succession. And my explanation for this is that people use succession planning as a catch-all. Succession planning can mean estate planning, it can mean financial planning, it can be leadership transition. And some people will do an estate plan and think that they have a succession plan. And a succession plan is way more complex than that. But these are the three things that are always correlated with successful succession. And they're all governance processes where we keep people on the same page, give people a sense of direction, create a sense of accountability. Family meetings on the family side, strategic planning, the management team thinking about the future of the business and planning for it, and the board of directors holding that management team accountable for creating the strategy and pursuing the strategy. So let's talk specifically about the board and how it fits into the family governance system. So there's a spectrum of governance from, we all have some governance from, we reach out to family and friends informally. That's usually how people start. Sometimes we then get employee input on how we're doing. Then maybe we start reaching out to industry associates. Maybe we join a peer group. Loyola, we had 10 peer groups of family business members sharing their experiences. And then you get to boards of advisors and boards of directors. But the board helps create alignment between the family, the employees, and the management team. They help kind of create the sense of accountability. And the thing is that most of the best practices that you guys hear about boards are based on a public company model. So the market model is what we see in quadrant 4 here, which is that they have millions of shareholders that are highly inactive and they have purely a financial interest. So when you look at a lot of articles on best practices on boards, think carefully about whether they fit for us as a family business, because many of those best practices come out of this public company market model. And if you think about it, it's the exact opposite of a family business. The family businesses most often operate in the control model, which is we have highly active shareholders and a relatively small number of shareholders. And so it's a very different environment. So your board as a private family held company should look a lot different and act a lot different than a public company board, because a public company board is about protecting nameless, faceless shareholders who are primarily interested in the financial returns, right? And that's very, very different than a family business. So just give you caution in evaluating best practices because of that. So let's talk a little bit about advisory board versus legal board. An advisory board has no fiduciary responsibility. It's non-binding, no legal liability, lower costs. Typically, you pay an advisory board less. And then a legal board has a fiduciary obligation to the shareholder. So even if I'm a family member serving on a fiduciary board, I can't just be there to represent my branch. I have a legal obligation to represent all of the shareholders, not just my family branch. The legal board's decisions are binding on management, whereas an advisory board's decisions aren't. The legal board is an ultimate legal authority for the company and carries some higher costs. And they have the ability to hire and fire the CEO. So that causes caution for some people, like, is my board going to fire me? The reality is that you can vote your board out tomorrow if you're really concerned about that and you have control and or the family's unified, you can get rid of a legal board at any point. So but this often is one of the things that gets people stuck. So I don't want people to get so caught up in legal versus advisory that they don't think about having a board for the core purposes of having a board. These are things you need to think about, but what we really want our board to do is to provide accountability to management for articulating and achieving a vision and a strategy that's consistent with the values, mission, and vision set forth by the family, right? So the role of the board is not to create the strategies, not to create the vision. In when you create a good board, they're not there to seek power and control. They don't want, a good director doesn't want to take over your company. A good director wants you to help you become more successful, use their talents, their background, their experiences to help you be successful. And one of the things that's important is that accountability piece. Is if I have to explain where we're going and what we're trying to do to some outsiders, just the fact that I have to explain that helps me think about my business differently, helps me organize my thoughts, helps me think about the future in a different way, even before the board has even spoken up, right? But then what happens is if you have the right directors, they bring their knowledge and experience and help you with the things that you don't know. So if I've grown from a $10 million company to a $15 million company, they may have the experience that helps me get from 15 to 30, right? They may bring experiences that help me with the next challenges. So if you go back to the worksheet that you guys got in the beginning and you look at some of the challenges that you identified, that board can help you think through some of those challenges that you identified and give you objective insight. And almost every family that I've worked with has said that putting a board in made a quantum leap in the business side of their equation. It's really earthquake proofing the house, right? A family's business is like a complex building. We were trying to plan for shocks. So what happens if dad dies tomorrow, right? Who's going to be there to help think about this? And I'll tell you a story about a family I've worked with for over 10 years now, but and I can tell you about 8 years ago, I was trying to get them to create a board, and we got to the point where we're interviewing directors, and dad freaks out, puts the company on the market for sale, goes through the process with investment bankers, finds out that he doesn't like the price that they can get for selling the company, recommits to being a family business, comes back to the idea of a board. So now we're 4 years ago. So that was a 4-year process right there. And we go through with setting up the board and having the independent directors. And a few years ago, he and his wife were on a cruise in the North Sea of up by Norway, and the boat gets caught in a storm. His wife gets washed away from him, not into the ocean or anything, but they get separated. They have to be airlifted off the boat in the middle of a storm. And this guy said to me after, thankfully they're both safe. They had some injuries, but it was a real shock because it was like, oh my gosh, this can happen at any point. But as he was getting airlifted off the boat, he said, the sense of peace that I had that we had a board in place and that they would look after the business as if something happened to me gave him a great sense of peace. And I just thought it was funny. That's what you were thinking of as you're getting airlifted off a boat. But it just goes to speak is that a board can help be a stabilizing force in the midst of a crisis, whether that crisis is a pandemic, whether it's the loss of the leader, or any of the strategic challenges that you may face as a business. It's a shock absorber. So let's talk about a little bit. So for a board to be effective, the family has to have some clear expectations for the company. What businesses do we want to be in? So I have a family that says we'll be in the defensive side of military contracts. We don't want to be on the offensive side of military contracts. At the basic level, we decide what businesses do we want to be in. A vision for the family's relationship with the business. So I have a family that writes a letter every year to their board saying, we are committed to remaining a family business. Our hopes for the company are X, Y, and Z. But they're regularly communicating about their commitment to the business and their goals for the business. But they also set clear boundaries between the family and the business. They have real rules and expectations for if somebody wants to sit on the board, if they want to work for the company. They've worked out those boundaries and created clear boundaries. But at the end of the day, the family has to also support the board's approved strategy. Now, the board needs to communicate to the family, what is that strategic plan? What's happening in our industry with our suppliers? What's happening with succession planning? What are the important successes or concerns that the company has moving forward? The board needs to help communicate with the family about these things. And when we talk about succession, typically when you're involving a board in the succession process, this can be helpful for especially founders to think about, is that a board can be a thought partner in helping me think about who should be my successor and how that process should go, right? I don't have to solve this problem by myself. So ideally, the board approves the selection of the successor. You would have a search committee typically in a succession process for the next CEO. Obviously, in many family businesses, we don't do external searches. At the very least, we should be thinking about what are the needs of the business, the skill sets that we need to face the strategic challenges that we're going to face, and how do they line up with our family members who are in the business, and how do they fit in relation to that role. And we may still go with a family successor, but we will want to round out the team with skill sets that can make sure that we can still meet the strategic challenges that we face. You know, a lot of people think about succession as just about who's the next CEO. The reality is, in a family business, we want to build a leadership team within the company that's so strong that it could survive 3 bad CEOs, right? We want a leadership team that is so strong that we can stomach some mistakes. We can get through these things. So the board can add credibility to the selection, ask some of those hard questions. It's much easier for an outsider to ask some questions, especially of the next generation, than a parent, right? A parent is the emotional impact of asking a question of the next generation is much harder than if it's an outsider. But the main job of the board is to make sure that we plan for succession and that it will happen at some point. The board monitors execution in the family business. It benchmarks progress against long-term goals. It encourages the conversation about long-term goals. One of the big things that happens in a lot of family businesses is we think year to year, and we think about strategy from a budgeting perspective. So we don't think beyond 12 or 24 months. We don't think about 5 years or 10 years or what's going to disrupt our industry. One of the families I've worked with is in the automotive space, and they provide a lot of additives and things that go into cars. But their business is built around internal combustion engines. Things are going electric. So they know that it's happening. And so what they did was they did 2 things. One, they had their advisory board, but then they set together a next gen board that would get the next gen's perspective on all the issues the main board was looking at. And then they set up an innovation division outside the operating company. They created a separate physical space, and their job, that innovation division, was tasked with finding the next products and disintermediating the existing business. So they were trying to make their existing business obsolete by creating new products. So they wouldn't have done that if they didn't have a board challenging them to think longer term, identifying the obstacles, and evaluate their strategies. So we'll know that the board is operating well when there's effective challenging of thoughts and ideas, and it's not about personalities, it's about ideas. That management is bringing some of their challenges proactively to the board before issues become critical, getting insight from the board to help them deal with those things. That we're reporting information that is material to the future of the business, and the group is fully informed when they're making decisions, right? These are all signs that our board is working well. Before I talk about challenges for non-family directors, I just want to highlight that all of these principles that I'm talking about can apply whether you've got an advisory board or a legal board. I often say, I don't care whether you've got an advisory board or a legal board, as long as you treat your board with seriousness, you let them hold you accountable, you let them challenge you and your thinking, and you let them help you build a bigger, stronger, better business. Because you can have a fiduciary board with all the legal authority in the world, but if you don't organize your meetings well, if you don't bring the right information to the table, if you don't want to listen to them, that board's not going to be effective. So the principle is, are we prepared to let a board hold us accountable for articulating a strategy and a vision and holding us accountable to achieving that? Now, you notice in that I'm saying they're not creating the strategy, right? The management team that runs the organization is creating the strategy. The board is holding them accountable. The board's going to help improve that strategy, hopefully, by asking good questions, by offering insights and opinions. But at the end of the day, it's your business. Your management team's the ones who are closest to the problem. They're going to be the ones that can create the vision. Are we ready to listen to people, and are we ready to let them help us improve our businesses and grow our businesses? So, oh, sorry, I forgot I didn't. So some of the challenges for a non-family member on a board is understanding the importance of family unity, especially if somebody has primarily public board experience. They're going to think everything's a business problem and you just need to keep the family out of the conversation. And that is the kiss of death for a family business. If you just try to treat something like a business problem and you don't take into account the importance of family unity. The non-family directors have to communicate with the family, build a relationship with the family. One of the families that I work with, they have the directors come into the family meetings and do a town hall and Q&A with the family members. It can be hard to be productively challenging sometimes. Families sometimes can be intimidating, but you want a director who's willing to challenge the traditional thinking. But these outsiders can play important roles. They can be mentors for management teams. So it's often very hard for a parent to mentor their next generation. So having an outsider on your board who can mentor the next generation can be super helpful. They can be more objective on sticky family business issues. And the other thing is family members tend to behave better when there are outsiders in the room than they do when families they're alone. The outsiders can keep succession on the front burner, bring experience that current management team doesn't have. So this was a question that came up in the beginning, which is subject matter expert versus personal characteristics in directors. The core capacity we want in any director, no matter what their skill set or experience is we want them to have the ability to hold management accountable. The personal values that align with the company and the family, and the willingness to speak up and challenge thinking. And it doesn't mean they're always challenging, but they're asking questions. They're doing it in a productive way to help the business survive and thrive. The end goal is we should all be aligned about the success and growth of the business over time. And the board's role is to hold us accountable for having a clear strategy of where we're going and accomplishing that strategy. So when you come down to the skill sets question, yes, we want to think about skill sets. So what are things that we don't know about? So if our strategy is going to be that we're going to have to acquire companies to grow because our market is so concentrated that the only way to grow is through acquisition, maybe we would have somebody with mergers and acquisitions expertise. But we want to vet that person carefully to make sure that they understand the family side of things, that they've got the interpersonal skill sets, the emotional intelligence to deal with challenging in a productive way. And I use mergers and acquisitions specifically because mergers and acquisitions people can be very deal oriented, and they sometimes don't think about the family implications. So I use that example specifically. So we have to not just look at the skill sets that we need to be successful, but the interpersonal characteristics, the emotional intelligence, the values alignment, the cultural alignment, to make sure that this person's going to be a good fit for our board. So you do need to think about skill sets, but I think what's really important is the values alignment and the willingness of this person to speak up and challenge your thinking, etc. So the outsiders can push for increased transparency, keep management focused on the right issues, and often if there are shareholders who aren't working for the business, having outsiders a part of the conversation can increase their confidence in the family business and where it's going. If you have good family sensitive directors, they can help the family identify family issues and work on those. The board members aren't there to mediate family fights. They're there to make sure that the family gets those things dealt with. They need to understand that it's not just a business issue, and they need to be productively challenging. So all of this is to say that we want the family to understand the role of the board is that the owners typically elect the board. They definitely do if it's a fiduciary board. You can obviously have a different process for an advisory board because you're not bound by the same legal rules. But the board's core job is accountability and selecting the CEO and overseeing the management team. Whereas the management team is responsible for the day-to-day leadership of the company, right? The board's not responsible for that absent a crisis. So another question that somebody asked was board size and meeting frequency. The typical cadence for most boards is quarterly. We would say 3 to 4 meetings a year would be the most appropriate. If you're only meeting twice a year, often the board doesn't have enough information to fulfill the role of accountability. If you're meeting more than 4 or 5 times a year, it's encouraging the board to get too deep into operations. And the board should not be deep into operational issues unless there's some sort of crisis. So that's where we say 3 to 4 board meetings a year. And in terms of size, if you have a board that's too large, you get diffusion of responsibility and meetings aren't as productive. And if you're too small, you don't have enough diversity of thought and opinion and ideas. So we say that typically between 5 to 9, 5 to 11, depending on the size of your and complexity of your company is the right size range. When you get over 12, you start to really, unless you've got a multi-billion-dollar business, boards over, even at that size level, boards over 12 tend to lose some of their effectiveness. So I would say if you're in that 5 to 9, 5 to 11, 7 to 11, somewhere in there, that makes sense. And then the other question is family versus non-family. My experience shows that most families start with 3 directors, 3 independent directors, and then have either 4 or 5 family members. Typically, families don't feel comfortable starting with a majority of outsiders. And the thing is, if you have only 1 independent director, they're a lone voice in the woods. If you have 2 independent directors, there's often not a critical mass of thought and opinion. Usually it's when you get at least 3 independent directors that you finally got a group that can work together. And often those independent directors may meet on their own to talk a little bit about how can we be effective in helping the family? How can we bring some of these issues forward in a way that the family can digest them and deal with them and work through them? So 3 is where most families start. And I do have some families that have progressed to the point where they have a majority of outside directors over family directors. So this is the classic governance model at the end of the day, that your owners elect your shareholder, the board of directors, and you have a chair of your board, and the board overlooks the management team. And then you have your family assembly or family council managing the family side of things, and that there's still, there's a clear line between these governance mechanisms. All right, so I'm gonna stop there. We've got about 5 minutes left, and we'll kind of go back to some of the questions here. So hopefully I've touched on some of the subject matter expert, board size, meeting frequency. So family versus non-family, talked a little bit about that. Again, if you're a family member, we want to be bringing family members to the board that have the capability of holding people accountable. So if there are family members that may or may not be able to fulfill that role effectively. And ideally, we want any family member sitting on the board to realize that they're representing the whole family. We don't want to have a branch mentality where we're thinking that somebody's here to be the voice of a branch. When we think in a branch mentality, it encourages us to talk about the divisions rather than building cohesion. So if we're a family member on the board, we're representing everybody, not just our branch. How to find the right directors. So the key is we don't want people that we already know, typically, who are friends, because they have skin in the game in terms of their relationships with us. You know, my firm just did a board evaluation for a large company in the Midwest. And what we found was that the independent directors were all country club friends of the CEO. And that was moderating. They weren't giving him the feedback that he wanted and needed, because they were afraid of, you know, if I give him this hard feedback, I might lose my relationship. We wouldn't feel comfortable playing golf at the club, etc. So when you find people who don't have connections with existing family members that are deep and could create those types of conflicts, you know, we want to find people who have that sense of objectivity, and their sole purpose is to provide that accountability and help you grow and build your businesses effectively. Now, finding them, you can hire search firms to do that. My firm does that. You can use networking through you know, your family business center to get things, and one of the things we'll do in the program in the spring is we'll actually go through the process of creating a description of what do we want our directors to look like, what type of skill sets do we want, what type of personal characteristics do we want, so that we could then share that description with people in our network and say, we're looking for somebody with this kind of background. Who do you have? I did that I'm going into interviews actually this afternoon in a board search for one of my clients, and we were missing in our process. We haven't been able to find somebody with strong HR experience. So I sent the description out to 4 or 5 people in my network, and now we have 6 new candidates that have that kind of HR experience. So so all of that's to say, networking, if you don't want to make the investment in a search firm, because not every family wants to engage with the search firm.
Andrew, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Really, one question that I hear a lot of is, should I put my professional advisors on my board? Should my lawyer be on my board? Should my accountant be on my board?
The answer is no, in my opinion, unless it's cheaper to put them on your board than to have them serving you in the other perspective, right? Because if they're serving on your board, you're typically just paying them a board fee and not an hourly rate. But I kind of say that that's kind of like a little bit flippant response, but you can get your advisors' opinions anytime. And, even the best advisors, any advisor should be always looking out for your best interests and putting your interests ahead of their own. But an advisor, let's say my company does $100,000 a year of legal work with my legal advisor. Is my legal advisor really going to give me his full opinion and create a conflict that might cause me to move my legal work, right? Yes, you could have somebody that can handle that possibly, but I think it's cleaner to just keep your advisors. You can get their advice and input and on everything, and they don't need to be on your board to give you that input and advice. What other questions do people have?
I think compensation was one that we heard.
So there are a bunch of compensation studies that have been done out there. They often correlate to the size of your company. So, the companies that I work with that are larger, that are maybe they're a couple $100 million in sales, they're typically paying their boards somewhere between $30,000 and $60,000 a year. Smaller companies under 100 million, you're probably looking at 10,000 to 25,000. But you don't want directors who are doing it for the money. You want directors who are there to help you create a bigger, stronger, better business. I'm happy to, I have access to those compensation studies. I can give you some of that data. And it's a little bit hard to compare because some boards pay just a pure retainer. Some then have additional fees for committee work and leadership roles. And so it's hard to break down, but those rough numbers, if you're kind of under 100 million, you 10 to 25, I've seen advisory boards as low as 5. But you want to show that the board that you're taking it seriously by compensating them at a significant level. And my friend Joe Astrachan likes to say that you should see your directors at the same level as your CEO in terms of compensation. So if you take your CEO's compensation and you break it down to, how many days a year, what would we pay our CEO if you added all their compensation together? What would be the daily rate we're paying our CEO? If we're asking for 10 days of our board's time, we would want that to be equivalent to 10 days of the CEO's time. That's another way to think about it. Any other questions?
Andrew, I have a question. In your experience, you got the family counseling, that you got the board, and if you were going to advise somebody, where would you start, or what are the criteria to consider that question?
Always asking the tough questions, Chris. No, that's a good one. That's a great question, actually. And it's a little bit of a chicken or an egg thing, and it's about getting started. I think that getting the family unified and giving them the capacity to speak with one voice is critically important, so that you're not getting management with direction from a bunch of, divergent opinions. But often the board is the easier one to put together because it's more business focused. And sometimes if there is disconnection within the family, the board can be a stabilizing force, right? So let's say there are shareholders who aren't working for the company and they're highly critical of family members who are running the company. Putting a board in place first might actually stabilize the conversation if the process is done well and those people who are outside the business are a part of that process of selecting the directors, it can calm them down that there's somebody overseeing the management team at the business, and it can make it easier to address the family things. So this is one of those dichotomy things. Like, in our minds, we'd like it to be like, oh, we start on the family first, or oh, we start on the business first. But the nuance is, how do we know when do we need to do the family stuff first, and when do we need to do the business stuff first? And it's not always a simple either or.
Depends.
Yep.
Thanks.
There's one last question I got in the chat. Are directors and advisors compensated the same?
From versus with an advisory board versus a fiduciary board, you set the compensation at whatever level you feel is appropriate. So in general, when you look at the data, when you compare advisory boards to boards of directors, the directors tend to be paid, or the advisors tend to be paid less. Advisory boards tend to be paid less than fiduciary boards. But at the end of the day, it comes down to, what do we need to pay to get people who have who are qualified to serve and capable of giving us the input and insights that we need, and what compensation level shows enough respect for their thoughts and opinions. And I do like that metaphor of the CEO's time. We should, at the very minimum, we should value our directors' time